Species, CITES has rejected a proposal to include all African elephants in its highest category of protection, which bans trade in species facing extinction. A coalition of 29 African countries led by Kenya and Benin had pressed for African elephants to be put in the CITES Appendix I category. This is the highest category of protection, which bans trade in species facing extinction. The CITES conference also heavily defeated a proposal to legalize rhino horn trade. The Johannesburg meeting, which ends on Wednesday, is sifting through 62 proposals to tighten or loosen trade restrictions on around 500 species. According to CITES, illegal trade in wildlife is valued at around $20 billion a year. Delegates have already voted to ban all international trade in African grey parrots, one of the world's most trafficked birds. A CITES treaty signed by 182 countries and the European Union protects about 5,600 animal and 30,000 plant species from over-exploitation through commercial trade. Now, to shed more light on the above issues, we are joined live in studio by Kadu Sibunya, President of African Wildlife Foundation. Kadu, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, as the President of the African Wildlife Foundation, which issues did you bring to the table, and how were your proposals met?
Look, like I said, we are the African Wildlife Foundation. We're the largest conservation organization focused on Africa. We are Pan-African. The issues we brought to CITES is really basically the voice of a Pan-African voice to the issues being discussed. This is an international organization which involves countries negotiating the trade. And as the largest conservation organization, our really focus was how these countries can negotiate a pact which benefits all Africans, and the issues were tough, but we think that the negotiations went very well.
Now, 62 proposals to tighten or loosen trade restrictions on around 500 species. The conference ends on Wednesday. How far are you, and how's the process been going?
It's going on very well, and I think most of the agreements actually have been reached on consensus. The voting was good, but this is an international trade agreement, and countries come together to negotiate how trade in wildlife is. You see, what we've seen today emphasizes the fact that there are no winners here. There are challenges faced by countries, there are implications for global implication on it. So the negotiation a good place for us conservationists, because conservation needs to be business. And we are happy with the process, but we also know and sober that the solutions to conservation is not really on trade, but for Africans to take these issues as part of our conservation, as part of our development, as part of our heritage, and part of our future.
Now, the CITES meeting has rejected a proposal to include all African elephants in its highest category of protection, which bans trade in species facing extinction. What does this mean for the continent exactly?
It doesn't change much really, because the Appendix II, where they belong, is still an illegal trade. So the changes in terms of how we deal with this trade has not changed at all. The trade is going to stay illegal, which is very good for the continent. But I think what we need to focus on now is how do we solve the problems like a country like Zimbabwe has brought up to us, that there's a challenge in conserving the second largest population of elephants. There are things which are working very well in Zimbabwe. We need to congratulate them for them to be able to hold the largest herd of elephants on the continent. The challenges for Zimbabwe are real, but we think that the solution is not in the sale of ivory. Ivory belongs to a living animal. But I think this is an opportunity for us as Africans to look beyond what CITES has offered us and try to find a Pan-African solution to this, based on the idea what AU is talking about, the future we want for Africa. That's in our Vision 2063.
Now, you touched on something very, very important, where reaction to some of the rejections that have taken place, where some countries have come out and some foundations have come out and said, but the stockpile that we have currently may be able to assist our countries economically, why then are they not being able to get some time to say, up until this point in time, you can dispose of the stockpiles that you have currently, and thereafter benefit the countries, and thereafter adhere to the rules and regulations of the CITES and what is finalized at the conference.
Yeah, that's well put. But with the challenge we are faced with on the continent, you need to look at this from a very continental level. We are losing more than 30,000 alphas on the continent. Yes, the frontline countries have the challenges of conserving this wildlife, especially a country like Zimbabwe, where the population is really very high. The problem is that by allowing one country to sell its ivory, you are affecting so many other countries on the continent. That's why, as an organization working in different countries in Africa, we are calling for a pan-African solution to this. But also we know that the solution lies in stopping the killing, in stopping the trafficking, but most important, to stop the demand in the recipient countries. So the solution really is not going to be in the sale, but in those three categories.
Now, let's speak about the reaction from African countries as a whole with regards to decisions taken at the CITES Conference 1, and 2, the countries who are the end recipients of ivory, for instance, or ivory products, their reaction to everything that's taking place. Within the past 8 days that CITES has been on,
I think this is a global meeting where the buyers and sellers, recipient countries and selling countries sit and negotiate these deals. But I would just talk to as Africans. We really need to have a pan-African solution to this. We have a framework to start negotiating these issues. The best framework we have is what AU has offered us, the Africa we want. This is the vision we have of 2063, which all countries in Africa have signed on. The challenge we have today is that how are we going to solve the problems of today in order to realize the Africa we want in 1963, I mean 2063. The process is going to be with us sitting together like we do with business, like we did when we are fighting for independence, like we did when we are fighting for apartheid. Here in South Africa, we came together and said no to some of these issues. SADC comes together and discuss the customs, the tariffs around. Conservation needs to be looked that way. As Africans, we really need to come together and say, what has worked in Kenya? What has worked in Uganda? What are the challenges of Zimbabwe? What can we learn from each other? What is that solution that Africa wants? As African Wildlife Foundation, we are calling to Africa to start looking at these resources as pan-African resources. Let us look at these as borderless countries. And that's the vision 2063 is calling for us to do.
Now, Kadu, your organization, among others, have been fighting for to have lions listed as endangered species, which would completely ban the trade of lions and their body parts or products. Did the trade agreement sort of discussed at CITES conference meet your expectations, and the results that you have from the conference? Are you happy with that?
We would have wished that lions to be trade in lion parts to be banned globally. But also we are aware that that is not going to solve our problems. The tiger parts have been banned for quite a long time, but still there is illegal trade. So that is really not going to be the only solution to the problem. It helps. It's a bandage to the wound. It stops the bleeding, but we need to find the cure. The cure is going to be in the sources of which impacts conservation of lions altogether. We've lost more than half. Some countries in Africa, especially in West Africa, have lost lions. So we really need to look at this. What the biggest cause of lions is the human-wildlife conflict caused by retaliatory killing of lions. We need to find a solution to that. The solution is not going to be here at CITES, but the solution is going to be the mechanisms we put in place, the budgets countries invest in, the benefits communities realize from conservation, the tourism as part of the solution to this, but also the heritage Africa realizes from our resources.
You mentioned earlier that I think the tiger, there's been restrictions on the tiger and a banning of, an entire banning to ensure that it's protected, but nothing has helped with poaching. Is this going to be enough? Is this, you know, you talk of a talk shop or another conference between African countries coming together and saying, no, this is enough. What else needs to happen? What action needs to be brought in place to ensure that if a trade agreement is reached, it is enforced, and people who do not work towards this are punished for not adhering to the rules and regulations of the trade agreement?
Demand is a big part of the solution to this. As Africa, we should be united in calling the recipient countries of our products, like in Asia, in North America, to try to ban trade in either rhino horns, ivory, or lion parts. That is the voice we need to send clearly out of Africa. But that's not all. We need to address also our wildlife laws. We have to be a little bit more strict about our laws, about trafficking. As the African Wildlife Foundation, we've been working with a number of countries on the continent to address those issues. There are several countries where we've provided dogs, sniffing dogs at the airports to address the trafficking issues. We've trained legal aspects and addressing the judiciary, how we collect evidence. All these things need to be a package. But remember, it's an international trade. So countries coming together to address the borders issues, to address the trafficking from one country to another. In East Africa, where I come from, a lot of the countries there are transiting countries. So we need to address these issues of custom issues. So it's a huge industry. It's a criminal, it's an illegal industry. It doesn't benefit any African country at all, or very, very few Africans who benefit. We need to go for it as Africans.
Now, according to CITES, illegal trade in wildlife is valued at around $20 billion a year. Now, which wildlife is mostly affected in Kenya?
Kenya actually, as a country, is doing very well in terms of, we've seen, they were hit at one time, but we've seen the population of elephants increasing. We've seen that they've completely eliminated the loss poaching around rhinos. So there is a progress in Kenya, but it's a transit country.
But how did they get it right? Apart from being a transit country, we saw a couple of months ago where Kenya's stockpile was burnt. How did Kenya get it right?
Those are some of the things we need to look at. Kenya did that to send a clear message to the rest of the world that they're not going to tolerate trade. This commodity is not tradable, that ivory belongs to a living elephant, and Kenya is saying that we benefit more by having live elephants in our country. Those kind of clear messages Africa or nations send to the rest of the world, especially the demanding countries, is very, very clear. We had these last 2 weeks, and we all know that the rhino horn has no medicinal properties. So one wonders why anyone would like to cling on the idea that selling ivory and benefiting from it is a good business. But it's not, because it's based on a false assumption.
Now, what are your hopes beyond the CITES conference?
I think we've seen, one of the things we've seen at CITES is the consensus we've seen among countries on a number of proposals which have been put there. That has been good news. The other good news out of CITES is that there's this agreement and understanding that conservation is a business. That's a good thing, message we are sending to everybody, that we are not conserving these resources as an end in itself. It's good business for anyone who is involved in conservation. But I think beyond CITES, Again, we need to look at this. CITES is not going to solve our problems. We need to look at this as Africans. These are our resources we need to protect. These are part of our development partner. I think the discussion immediately, which we are calling for to start, is what kind of vision do we want in Africa? What is the role of wildlife and wildlands in our aspiration for development? That discussion needs to start yesterday. We need to make that decision. Remember, Africa is the most growing continent globally. There's a lot of investment coming into our continent. We need to quickly understand what resources do we need to protect for our own development. For hydro generation, you need water. Water comes from certain areas, which are water towers. And I'll tell you, most of the water towers for the continent are in protected areas. And elephants or wildlife plays a big role for our conservation of our water, our climate. So it's very important that we start that discussion in Africa on how we relate wildlife and wildlands to our development. It's not going to be a conversation among conservationists, but also to involve our leaders. We need to hear African voice on these issues. I would like to hear a lot of CEOs pronounce themselves, for example, what's their role of wildlife and wildlands in the development of their companies. We need to hear central bank governors. We need to hear our leaders pronounce themselves on this.
Now, we speak of private companies, private entities, we speak of governments putting their voices forward. Some governments have come forward and are assisting with that role in terms of trying to curb poaching in different countries on the African continent. Now, in terms of that, poachers, should we look at it as an economic issue where you find that some poachers come from the poorest of poor areas? What drives an individual to start to go into a poaching industry where they kill wildlife whom they've been living amongst for many years?
It's really an economic issue, and that's why we, at African Wildlife Foundation, we don't look at poaching or conservation purely from the science of conservation. We run different programs. For example, we have Classroom Africa, where we build schools among communities near national parks to educate the future generation near these parks to not to be poachers like their parents would be. We do have start businesses. We support agriculture. We support communities getting involved in the tourism industry. But at the same time, we support national parks to increase their capacity in managing wildlife inside the parks. So there has to be a different set of tools to address the conservation aspects. But poaching in many countries is a hard thing. It's an illegal activity. A lot of people do it to put food on the table without options. So we are calling on governments to look at this and support different economies around these national parks, but also to raise awareness that conservation is business and start looking at the opportunities for our communities and people to benefit from wildlife conservation.
Now, very quickly, looking at this, for instance, an example that I can use is maybe the Asian markets, who have a very big on ivory trade and rhino horn trade. What's their reaction been to the CITES conference, and what is being said? Because they are here, they are being represented. Yeah,
we've seen some reaction from the Asian market, especially China, has pronounced itself that they started a discussion on trade in ivory within China. US, which was a huge market, has banned the export of so many of these wildlife parts, and that's good news. But it's very urgent business. We hear China needs another discussion, needs time to organize and decide when this will happen. Africans, we need to call China to take this action as soon as possible. But China is our biggest partner too, in terms of economic investments on the continent. So we need to start the discussion with our new partner on the continent to address wildlife and wildlife conservation. China needs to be a big player in conservation in Africa, like other partners, with development partners we have on the continent. But that can't be separate from the business China is doing on the continent, because wildlife and wildplace is part of our development. It has to be part of that. And as Africa Wildlife Foundation, we are the voice on the continent. We've been working on the continent for more than 50 years. And over time, we've gained that position of the voice of wildlife and wildlife on the continent. But we would like to see more African voices on this issue.
Kadu, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. We have to leave it there for now. I would have loved to take it even further. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
That was Kadu Sibunya, President of African Wildlife Foundation, speaking to us about the current CITES 2016 conference.